This interview is part of our Epic Risk video series on how top supply chain executives manage supply chain risk. Epic is our proprietary UT Knoxville Risk Index that measures economic, political, infrastructure, competency, diversity, and climate change risk in 60 countries around the world. While we measure supply chain risk at a country level using Epic, we are looking to experts to tell us how they deal with ongoing risks that are both foreseen and unforeseen. Tony Zuazo is a former EVP of Global Supply Chain at Dollar General. With more than 35 years of retail experience, Tony has driven enterprise-wide business process solutions, including in the areas of supply chain management, pricing strategy, and technology implementations. Under his leadership, Dollar General expanded its distribution center network and retail private fleet, as well as added 2 new facilities. Tony and his supply chain team were responsible for the delivery of household essentials to the more than 19,000 Dollar General stores across 47 states, helping customers stretch their budget while serving them with value and convenience. Welcome, Tony Zuazo, to our interview about dealing with supply chain risk.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So my first question is, in response to COVID-19, a lot of companies had faced disruptions, which we know were ubiquitous throughout supply chain industries and throughout the world. So in your experience, what was the sort of response to this? How did companies manage risks?
I think it was, first of all, it was complicated. And I think there's been a lot of discussion around this, but we've never faced a situation like this in the past. So this is not your typical risk scenarios where you do some prep or you do some scenario planning. So we had to learn a lot about the situation as we went, and honestly had to pivot sometimes and make some choices and then make some edits to those choices and revisit them and go in a different direction as we learn through it. So we learned a lot about managing risk, managing adversity, and we got a lot of interesting PR for supply chain.
So what were some of your key takeaways from that? I know that some companies were talking about increasing visibility through the supply chain or increasing inventory. What do you think is most important?
I think, I've always thought about visibility as being very important, and I think it became uber important at that point because we needed to know where things were, where they were in the process, where they were in transit, where they were from a production perspective. But I think it's not just traditional visibility to say, hey, I can see something and know where it is on a map type of thing, but you needed to understand what was happening with your suppliers and what were their issues. So it was more so traditional visibility that you can just pull up on a screen, but some of that happened through conversations and the ability to collaborate with suppliers upstream. And depending on your segment of the business, you may have to go several times upstream to understand what those challenges were. A lot of production issues were faced in either raw materials or final production. And so working through those challenges became a collaborative experience versus just a traditional, let's pull up on the screen where a truck is.
So is that something that you would recommend in terms of, I hope that we don't have another event like COVID that happens, but you never know. Would that be a key element of planning for this kind of like system-wide disruption, or what else might be important for planning?
Absolutely. I think visibility is ultra important. Just to run your business, but then when you get into situations with disruptions, whether they're COVID-like disruptions or even weather disruptions, regional weather disruptions that create situations for your organization. So I think first and foremost, you got to have a visibility platform of some kind in place to help you navigate that on a day-to-day, but then also from a disruptive perspective. I think collaboration is ultra important. The one thing you find about collaboration is you can't collaborate very well at the point of failure, because then you're into firefighting and you're into finger pointing. And so it becomes tough to navigate a collaborative situation versus just a one-sided situation. So I think you have to have those key relationships built out and be collaborating up front. And then so when you get into those situations, you have a more productive environment. And outside of that, I think you just have to prepare your organization for those challenges as it relates to how do we pivot, how dynamic are we, and is our team ready to kind of get behind this and hunker down and work on the situation versus everyone gets frustrated and wants to go home. And less about like, let's prepare for COVID, but let's prepare for some level of disruption. Whether you're going to do a scenario plan on that, you're going to do a tabletop pilot around kind of what that looks like. We've done them in the past around weather situations, around various labor situations. So I think all those are important to do because you can really then understand what's my system situation look like? Can I process things without power? How do I do payroll? How do I pay my thousands of employees? Simple things like that I would say are simple, but super complicated when you take away the system capabilities because you had a disaster, as an example. Or, you have to shut down facilities for some reason, whether it was a natural disaster, COVID restrictions. And how does the rest of your supply chain react to those? And can you pivot and move your capabilities to other places, or are you single threaded?
You had said that, you can have all the assets you want, but you have to be able to pivot. You have to be able to use assets flexibly when there is a crisis. What did you mean by that?
I think about kind of the approach of having a regional kind of supply chain versus a national supply chain. And what that means for me is you have to have the system capabilities to be able to move assets. Yeah, you can move a truck and put it over here, but if you can't utilize that equipment systemically, same thing with your warehouse assets or your distribution assets. If you can't move customers, you can't move your own retail footprint to another distribution center, it doesn't really help you. So I think you have to have that base foundation that says, I think about, and if you're in a retail environment, I can ship any store from any distribution center on the fly. I don't have to go set up an IT project to go move this customer or this unit to this other facility. I can do that systemically on the fly if I need to. So if I have a disruption, we're not sitting here scenario planning with IT on how many days it's going to take to be able to move these stores over here. So I think putting things like that in place ahead of disruptions, whether they're regional or national, is important because that gives you ultra flexibility in your network. And whether you have 2 distribution centers or 50 distribution centers, you want to be able to use the 2 or you want to be able to use the 50 to get all the work done that you need to do.
So is that a matter of training people to be flexible or having like IT processes in place that will reroute things, or what does it come down to?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's really about having the technology to be able to do it. The training part's important because then as things happen, whether they're small or large, your team can react and do it on their own without needing to bring in a big IT project to get that done in several days or several weeks. And by the time you're done, maybe that disruption has subsided and you can move away from it. So I think fundamentally you have to have the IT capabilities to be able to do that.
I think we had talked a little bit about this before, but if you have a lot of your own assets, and if those assets you can, juggle between those flexibly, why do you need third-party suppliers or providers?
I think third-party providers are instrumental to the overall supply chain footprint. In my experience, based on being what I call asset heavy, meaning having a lot of assets, whether it's distribution centers or tractors and trailers, we've utilized third parties to help with flex, surge, and then also balance the business, right? You can't have surge if you're 100% company owned, as an example, and no third party, because when you go out to third party during flex times, they may not be available for you. So you kind of retain a level of third party every day. That way, when you flex, you have the ability to use that third party to flex. It's very difficult to onboard a third party in times of need. Having them in your network as a base helps you be able to build those flex relationships with them, so they know that they're going to be a support system when things go up. And then you manage things on the way down. If you have trouble where you don't have enough volume for everybody, you make sure that they get a fair share so they're still in the game.
So we're looking at this EPIC supply chain risk list in terms of measuring supply chain risk in different countries. And I know that you've done business in different countries. You've done business in the US as well as Mexico. How does your supply chain risk strategy differ in engaging supply chains in these 2 really different countries or different scenarios?
Yeah, and I also have experience in the past in Canada, and I think every country has its own challenges, unique situations, and you really can't take a global risk approach here. You can, as flow of goods happens globally, but when it comes to operations in those countries, you really have to take a look at what the risks factors are in those countries. You look at certain countries that have a higher theft rate of transport. So you really have to manage that and understand what are you going to do differently on transport to manage the potential theft risk of your product. And so I think you really have to assess that country and what the situation is across all your components and supply chain, which is, going to be your inventory holding, your transport, your self distribution, your third party distribution, and ensure that you're going to be able to be successful there based on that, and then lowering the risk profile accordingly as you make the various changes in those countries. But I would say it's not a, hey, what are we doing in the US? Let's copy it to another country. You have to look and assess and make sure you're supporting the needs of that country or that region or wherever else you're operating outside the US. So I think it's a little naive just to go in and plant your US footprint in another country.
How do you assess the risk in different countries? I know there are risks that that go beyond boundaries, and we're facing a lot of like geopolitical tensions. We're facing, climate change risk and things of that nature. How do you go about doing that?
I mean, I think you have to have some intelligence on the ground to tell you what's going on. And it could be your team, it could be third parties. I think there's a lot of resources locally, just like, here in the US, we can leverage government resources, third party resources to understand the situations and then start to amass the potential risk portfolio. And then from there, I think you're just, figuring out which ones you really want to tackle because, no one has the ability to go 100% risk protection on all these things. So you're going to have to prioritize, determine what you want to do and what you want to invest in and what you want to protect to ensure that you can be successful in those places. But you have to really be on the ground and understand what it is there versus trying to, manage this from afar and put in a plan from afar. It has to be a localized effort.
What kinds of risk strategies should you have as, a supply chain executive? So, in some of my research, I've talked to supply chain executives, and they've mentioned always having, backup suppliers, potentially additional warehouses, distribution centers that they could ship to or from, potentially having backup, factories or operations, things like that. Do you think that should be like foremost on the list, or are there other risk strategies that you think are equally important?
Yeah, I think all those are important. I think it does vary based on the type of business you're in, and your tolerance to, let's say, spend on those types of situations because you're buying insurance, right? You're either kind of putting some assets that you're not using on the table. That way, when you need them, they're there, right? And so it's an insurance policy, and so you also have to understand how much are you willing to pay for insurance. And is that worth the potential risk side of what you're going to lose? That's where I think third parties come in very well because they have a more flexible model, right? They have a large customer base that they're flexing. So having a portfolio of third parties in your supply chain helps you manage that flex or risk or whatever you're dealing with because you're definitely prioritized. Once you're a customer, you're going to get priority over somebody new trying to call on them and trying to get some space or trying to get some equipment or trying to get something done. So I think having a healthy balance there, like we talked about earlier, allows you to be able to support that without maybe having it as an asset on your books, right? I'm not going to go have a warehouse, have it dark, and then use it for that rainy day. Some might, but you have to have the capability to do that and want to spend on those types of solutions. And I think the same thing applies from your supplier base, especially when you think about international. I think it applies to anybody that's handling your movements, whether that's an ocean, whether that's an over the road, and how do you balance the provider base there because their failures every day.
Mm-hmm.
They're just smaller. There could be one failure. There could be a ship that failed. And so those things you have to be nimble enough to where you can manage where you're like, well, I'm on this one liner and that's all I got. I can't go anywhere else because now I'm playing the spot market and it's not favorable today or it is favorable. And so you kind of have a balanced approach there. If I'm running import business, I'm not going to have one ocean liner running all of my business. If I'm running over the road, same thing. I'm not going to have one provider. I may have many. It may be a regional approach. Even on ocean, it may be a country approach. Or I may diversify even some countries if I have a lot of product coming out of China and may have multiple providers there. So I think the multiple providers is a good way to balance that. And that way, when things go wrong with a provider, whether it could be a cyber attack that shuts them down and none of those things are moving, whether it's an ocean ship or it's an over the road situation, you de-risk some of your business because cyber is another risk that who knows when it's going to happen to who it's going to happen to. They happen all the time. So I think having that balanced approach will help you navigate some of that.
So do you think cyber risk is the biggest risk that supply chain executives face, or what do you think is the biggest risk, and how can supply chain executives prevent or maybe build resilience to that risk?
Yeah, I hate saying it depends to you every time, but I feel like that's my starting answer because I think cyber risk is at the top and it has been at the top. And I think prior to COVID, it may have been pretty high on everybody's. And I think, pandemic probably took the reign over cyber, but I think it goes back to what is your portfolio of providers? And if one of them is offline because of cyber, what happens to you? And if you can manage that to a certain degree, then I think you're okay. So maybe cyber isn't as high for you. But if you have 3 or 4 key suppliers that run a large piece of your business, whether they're providers, service providers, or suppliers, and then I think cyber's got to be high because if you take that one person off your network, what happens? So I think it's a network assessment. And if you have a certain provider or supplier that takes a certain large percentage of your business, then I think cyber has got to be top of mind for you. If everyone has single digit percentages and you've diversified, then cyber's on your list, but maybe not at the top of the list.
Is the way that you deal with these different risks different depending on the different kinds of risk, or do you look at it, as you said, in terms of like the network and think about if different nodes are taken out? Is that the way you look at it, or do you consider different risk and think about what they could potentially do?
I do think there's an intersection of your internal supply chain with your external supply chain. And those intersections become your risk kind of profile, right? And I think there is a varying degree of something that could affect, one segment of your supply chain or a node or a region. And like we talked about earlier, what can you do to move those capabilities to somewhere else? And so I think that's, to me, part of that scenario planning process, whether you do like a tabletop scenario around a natural disaster that hits a region, and what does that mean for you? Or you do something broader that hits, multiple regions. I think those are all good exercises to help you dissect what your risk is and where you may have risks on continuity within your supply chain.
What's your feeling? A lot of supply chain executives have listed geopolitical risk as one of the top risks that their supply chains face. Do you agree that this is a really large risk? And what do you think supply chain execs can do about it?
Yeah, I would say it is. Here's the reason why I think it's important for everyone, whether you're into the politics side of things or not. It has an adverse effect on commodities. And so once it has that, then everyone's technically affected. And I would say one of the larger commodities for supply chain folks is fuel and the cost of fuel or the volatility in fuel associated with geopolitical. And you saw that through Ukraine, not to mention other raw materials and things that were coming out of the region or things that were coming out of regions that were impacted by them. So there's a lot of kind of secondary effects of that. But for sure, you have to be aware of it and you have to understand it. Fuel's an animal in and of itself and how you manage that and understand your fuel expenses and what you can do to manage those. But I think awareness is important. And it helps you inform financial plans depending on how much fuel is a part of your financial model. And And then you get into just availability of product and movements. I know during previous geopolitical situations that were in part of the world, it affected ocean movements in other parts of the world. And so you kind of have to understand, and this is where I think the collaboration is very important, right? If you have really strong relationships with your ocean liners, you're going to be able to go to them and quickly assess, hey, what's happening here in Israel? How does this affect ocean movements across the globe for me, right? Not just general, because you're not being generally informed, but what does it mean for us? Are we good? Any concerns? Versus waiting for failures, and then they can come back and tell you, well, it was related to this. Movements couldn't come across, and so it got delayed. And so I think you can't be naive to the fact that something happening in Israel is not going to affect your flow of goods movement.
Thank you so much, Tony Zuazo. I really appreciate your interview.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Thanks.